Welcome to another video and another Misery Gauntlet build overview. This time it's none other than the championship winning build. It is of course Ben's volatile dead of seething Necromancer, and I have to say that feared encounter is the best Path of Exile gameplay I've ever seen. Absolutely incredible movement and skill usage. Just the right amount of greed to be able to deal just enough damage to kill off the Elder and then the Shaper early on. And it was a bit hairy there for a while trying to get the Cortex down, but once he did that and those degen puddles were gone, it was pretty much in the bag from there on out. For me, Ben's feared fight was the pinnacle of the entire gauntlet. I loved the casting from Zizaran and Steelmage as well over on the official broadcast. When they were watching it live, they were absolutely losing their minds. There were some really close calls in some of those boss fights too. It kind of demonstrated just how close he was to dying at some points and how one misstep at any moment may have been his last. But there were no missteps, and Ben, the absolute madman, went on to full clear the Misery Gauntlet, an event that many thought may be impossible, especially without Eternal Damnation. And so this video, as you may have guessed, is all about the championship build, Ben's volatile dead of seething Necromancer. So let's head over to the path of building for a closer look. Now, if you were following Ben's progress through the bosses, you would have noticed just how much respecking he was doing to change up his build so that it was better suited for each encounter. But in this video, we'll be looking at the setup that he used in the Maven invitation for the Feared. And really, I think this is the best version of the build to analyze because it's the one that's designed to fight 5 very different bosses all at once. Unlike some of the other encounters where you can focus all of your defenses against one particular damage type or boss ability, you just can't get away with that here. So a couple of notes before we get into it. First, the damage. This is obviously not the correct damage. In truth, this build will deal varying amounts of damage based on which zone it's in because the damage is derived from corpse life. We'll get into that more later in the video. And second, I've got these 2 utility flasks active. They both have the modifier that gains 3 charges when hit, and I'd estimate that the Granite Flask had about 75% uptime in the feared encounter, and the Sapphire Flask had something like 90% uptime, because Ben was getting hit a lot. One of the biggest downsides of this build is actually that it basically needs to face tank some of the bosses to actually deal damage. More on that later. So let's begin with the Necromancer Ascendancy, and the Mistress of Sacrifice Ascendancy notable. This one allows offerings to also affect you with 50% reduced effect, and when combined with the increased skill effect duration and the Betrayal trigger modifier crafted on the Scepter, this makes a Bone Offering grant 20% chance to block spells all of the time. You may notice that it's not providing any attack block, and that's because Ben is using a unique shield, Sapphal's Frame. This shield prevents you from blocking attacks, but grants a large amount of spell block as a trade-off. Ben is also using the Tempest Shield Reservation skill, which grants shock immunity, but importantly also provides a further chunk of spell block, and these 3 sources of spell block combined bring the total up to 74% chance to block spell damage. If a spell hit makes it through spell block, the damage will be lessened by the 100% chance to suppress spell damage. This is made up in part from the Inveterate wheel on the passive tree down here, and the Instinct wheel taken up here too. And a Primalist Charm which grants 15% chance to suppress spell damage. The remaining chance comes from the modifiers on the helmet and gloves. Now, baseline Suppression lessens the damage taken from spell hits by 50%, but Ben is using the Inveterate Notable and the Spell Suppression Mastery, taken up here, for a further 3% suppressed spell damage on each respectively, for a total of 56% less damage taken from spell hits. Another Spell Suppression Mastery, taken down here, makes it so that spell hits can no longer inflict elemental ailments, which is especially strong against the Feared. Next, let's look at the maximum resistances that this build is able to achieve. As mentioned earlier, Ben is using Sapphal's Frame, and on top of the huge chunk of spell block that it provides, it also grants 4% to all maximum resistances, which includes Chaos Resistance as well. Ben is also anointing Prismatic Skin for a further 2% to maximum elemental resistances, and this is the extent of maximum cold resistance which the build is able to achieve, and so it sits at 81%. But the others are a bit higher still, so let's take a look at where those maximum resistances are coming from. Ben is using both Purity of Fire and Purity of Lightning, which are both corrupted for level 21, improved to level 23 via the unveiled AoE gem modifier on the gloves. And these auras grant 5% to maximum fire and lightning resistance respectively, improved to 7% by 40% increased aura effect. There's also an extra 1% maximum lightning resistance granted from an Eldritch implicit on the helmet. Meanwhile, the Divine Flesh Timeless Keystone, which is gained from the Glorious Vanity Jewel when it's in the name of Zibaqua, provides 5% to maximum chaos resistance. And all of these modifiers combined bring the final resistances to 88% fire, 81% cold, 89% lightning, and 84% chaos. Now, scaling maximum resistances is a powerful defense, but even better still is a way to apply armor post-resistance mitigation. At the same time, the Shaper is one of the bosses encountered in the field, and his Ball ability, which deals pure cold damage, also has a large amount of cold penetration, which devastates maximum resistances as a defensive layer. So to solve both of these problems, Ben is using the Divine Flesh Keystone combined with the 4th Vow unique body armor. Divine Flesh makes 50% of all elemental damage be taken as chaos damage instead. And you may be thinking, that's bad for fire and lightning damage since chaos resistance is lower. However, the 4th Vow applies the full armor calculation to chaos damage taken from hits. So this means that the 50% of elemental damage that is instead taken as chaos damage is first being mitigated by the 84% chaos resistance, and then it's further being reduced by the damage reduction provided by armor. Importantly, if that damage originated with damage type penetration, like a Shaper Ball with cold penetration, that penetration can no longer apply, as this portion of damage is now being taken as chaos damage. So this build is able to avoid penetration on 50% of the incoming elemental hit damage. The remaining 50% of the damage is taken as the originating elemental damage type, and in the case of the Shaper Balls, this damage will penetrate cold resistance. Ben was prepared for this though, making use of a Sapphire Flask to lessen this portion of the damage. And this is important because, as I mentioned earlier, this build kind of needs to be able to face tank an ability like Shaper Balls in the field because it can't reliably deal damage while kiting. So what's going on there? Let's discuss how this build deals damage. A new transfigured gem, Volatile Dead of Seething, is being used. This ability is very similar to Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction in that it's focused on dealing damage through corpse explosions, and it explodes many corpses, making it a hit-based ability. Chain DD is the better skill, but all forms of Detonate Dead were banned for use in the Gauntlet, so Ben had to settle on VD of Seething. So this ability explodes 10 corpses instantly for 4% of their maximum life each. Desecrate spawns corpses with a fixed chance to spawn a corpse from your Spectre pool. This means you have a chance to spawn corpses with high life multipliers, as long as you've raised those corpses as Spectres previously so that they're saved in your Spectre corpse pool. Here's the thing, anytime Desecrate spawns a corpse that isn't a forced Spectre corpse, it will spawn a corpse randomly from the pool of corpses available in the current area. When you enter a zone, your entire Spectred corpse pool is added to the corpse pool for that zone. So by increasing your maximum Spectre limit, you can raise many unique high life Spectres which are then all saved to your Spectre corpse pool. Whenever you enter a zone, all of these corpses will be added to the corpse pool for that zone, which increases your chances of spawning a high life corpse whenever Desecrate doesn't choose a forced Spectre corpse. This is very impactful in zones which have a limited corpse pool, and a lot less impactful in zones which have naturally crowded corpse pools. Ben is using the corpse explosions from VD of Seething to inflict poison using the Inextricable Fate unique boots. This is why the build struggles to deal damage while kiting, because for this build to be able to inflict poison, the enemy must be nearby and be stationary for 1.5 seconds for Inextricable Fate's modifier to inflict 3 Grasping Vines. Then, once 3 Grasping Vines are on the enemy, all damage dealt will inflict poison. Importantly, this modifier allows all damage, including elemental damage, to inflict poison, and unlike Heist's Pneumatic Dagger base, or the implicit found on Tinctures, It states that all damage inflicts poison rather than all damage can inflict poison, meaning that chance to inflict poison is not required. So the full fire damage from the corpse explosion will inflict poison, and since this is elemental damage, the build can benefit fully from the 40% more elemental damage from elemental overload to further scale poison damage. Add to this the large amount of poison duration from the Unbound Ailment support gem, and from a Primalist charm down here, and the slower expiry of poisons from temporal chains, and these poisons really start to ramp up and deal some big damage. Not only that, but the Necromancer's Corpse Pact Ascendancy notable also increases cast speed for each corpse consumed recently. So for every time that Volatile Dead of Seething has been used in the past 4 seconds, the character has 20% increased cast speed, up to 200% if enough corpses have been consumed. This cast speed also increases the rate at which corpses are being spawned by Desecrate because it's linked to Arcanist Brand, which frees up the character to use VD even more often as you don't have to manually spawn corpses each cast, which further ramps up cast speed from Corpse Pact and ramps up poisons even faster. And this build really does have some insane ramp up, especially against those bosses like the Searing Exarch and the Eater of Worlds that naturally don't move around very much. It really starts to ramp up quickly and deal lots of damage. And to deal even more damage, Ben is making use of a charm for chance to inflict Withered, which makes enemies take increased chaos damage. When combined with the Chaos Mastery for a small chance to inflict the maximum amount of Withered debuffs, and with the amount of times the build is able to hit enemies in such a small space of time, it is not unreasonable for targets to have 15 Wither stacks, increasing the chaos damage they take by 90%. Alright, so we've discussed a lot of the defenses, but there's still some to go yet. Let's talk about physical damage, because really that's the huge weakness of this build. Ben has a small amount of physical damage from hits taken as elemental damage, that's 8% taken as fire on the crafted Corel helmet modifier, and 6% taken as lightning on the Eldritch implicit modifier also on the helmet. Ben is using the Determination Aura and Defiance banner, but even with a Granite Flask active, the total armor is just 28,000. Ben's also making use of Enduring Cry for the endurance charge generation that it provides, but the uptime of these charges in his Feared encounter wasn't great, mostly because he couldn't find the time to use the skill between dodging dangerous boss abilities and dealing damage. The end result is that this build can just about survive the incoming physical hits. You can see that in the footage just how much damage something like Aziri's range attack was dealing, and even some of the auto attacks from the other bosses were chunking him in the other encounters. But for the large physical hits, things like the Shaper Slam, these obviously have to be avoided at all costs. One very important thing to mention here about physical damage. In the encounters where better physical mitigation was required, Ben was using a different setup with a crafted rare body armor and the Power of Purpose Timeless Keystone. Next we have the Defiance of Destiny unique amulet, and Ben himself admitted just how much work this one put in during the Feared encounter. This unique amulet recovers 40% of missing unreserved life before taking a hit, and this added up to a lot of recovery. There were many times where the character had taken a hit that dealt a decent amount of damage, and subsequent smaller hits were recovering life due to this amulet. And I think in the latter stages of the Uber Elder encounter, this amulet also put in a lot of work there too. A lot of the adds that were spawning and the arena was kind of becoming overwhelmed, and with the constant damage coming in from the degen ground, those hits from the adds were recovering a lot of life there as well. And speaking of recovery, the life flasks have to be mentioned here because they put in a lot of work too. The triple bubbling Divine Flask setup, one to remove the bleeds inflicted by Aziri's spears, one to remove the reflected curses, and the third for spamming. All three enchanted with the Harvest modifier for additional maximum charges. And what you didn't see in the cut footage in the intro was that Ben logged twice during the Feared encounter to refill flasks and to recraft the Harvest enchants, and those flasks really did make all the difference. There's a few other things that should be mentioned as well. Ben is gaining chance to avoid stun from the modifiers on the 3 rare Ghastly Eye jewels, combined with the modifier on the boots, to reach 100% chance to avoid stuns. The soul of the Brine King major Pantheon power is being used for the freeze immunity that it provides, and for the minor Pantheon power, Ben is using the soul of Radhakesh. A very important pickup there. Not only is the no extra bleed damage while moving and reduced physical damage over time taken while moving very strong against the bleed inflicted by Aziri, but the reduced physical damage over time is also great against the ground damage over time from the Cortex boss too. And speaking of damage over time, Ben is using the Lethe Shade Keystone to help against things like the Shaper Beam and the Cortex Ground Dot. And this keystone is another reason why the bleed removal flask is so important, so that you can stop taking damage over time for this keystone's modifier to then be active again. There's also the damage over time mastery taken over here for 10% less damage taken from damage over time as well. This build is also able to apply a decent amount of action speed slow to bosses as well, with 10% chill coming from corpses spawned recently from the modifier on Corpse Pact, and 18% less action speed from temporal chains. Meanwhile, the Ascendancy notable prior to Corpse Pact, Plaguebringer, makes nearby enemies deal 10% reduced damage as long as there's a nearby corpse. And lastly, Ben is using Molten Shell linked to cast when damage taken, with access to Val Molten Shell for those difficult situations. And there you have it, Ben's Gauntlet winning Necromancer build, and this video marks the end of the build overview series for the Misery Gauntlet builds. I've had a lot of fun covering these builds, but these videos are also a ton of work, a lot of effort goes into making them and compiling all of the information, and I'll be moving on to some 3.24 League Star testing stuff and things like that. We're probably about a month or so away from the next League launch, so that will probably come round very quickly. I do want to briefly mention something regarding my channel at the end of this video. I'm moving away from YouTube channel memberships in favour of a new Patreon that I've set up. YouTube memberships just have ridiculous fees, so I apologise if you were a member of my channel before. But if you wish to support my channel, please do check out the new Patreon that I've set up. I'd love to be able to spend more of my time making content here on YouTube, and that will only be possible if I can get more people on board. So if my content helps you out in understanding Path of Exile's mechanics, or if it inspires you to make your own builds or try new things out, please consider supporting my channel by becoming a patron. The link is in the video description below. Thank you for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.